A tobacco nobody can smoke isn't a crop, son. It's a weed with paperwork. Kid's got no nicotine in it. So what'd he plant? Grass? Give it a few years, that ground'll change hands. 3 summers running, Elijah Carter cut his entire harvest and burned it in the field while half the county stood on the road and watched the smoke go up. 19 years old, 75 acres of the worst clay in North Carolina. Every neighbor certain he was finished. Then a woman from one of the biggest drug companies in America drove half the night to find him. And she wasn't there for the leaves. The night shift ended at 7 in the morning, and that was the only reason Elijah Carter had taken it. He left the house a little before 10 most nights and drove southeast out of Caswell County, out of a part of North Carolina where growing tobacco had been the only trade anybody had for 100 years, down into the research park outside Durham, where the buildings had no windows on the ground floor and the lot lights burned until dawn. The work was what the posting said it was. He emptied the biological waste bins, ran the floor scrubber down the long corridors, cleaned the glassware room where the technicians left their trays stacked in the sink, and wiped down break room tables that 400 people used and nobody claimed. It paid a little over minimum. Nobody else wanted the hours. He wanted them. The shift released him at 7, and by 8:30 he was back at the kitchen table in Caswell County with coffee going, which meant he was in the house in the afternoons, which was the entire point. His grandfather was 81 and had started needing somebody there. Eli was not cleared to enter the clean rooms. He mopped the corridor outside them, along the base of the glass, and he had been doing it for 2 years. And what stayed with him afterward was not the mop or the bins or the smell of the glassware room. It was growth chamber 3. There was tobacco inside it. He recognized it through the door the first week because he had grown up inside the crop, had ridden on the back of a setter before he was old enough to be useful, had spent Augusts handing leaf up to a man in the top of a barn. But the plants in that chamber were wrong in every particular. Short, barely up past a person's knee, leaves thick as felt and a deeper green than anything that ever came out of a Caswell field. They stood in trays under panel lights, on a schedule printed and taped to the door, tended by people in gowns who treated them the way a hospital treats equipment. Nobody explained any of it to him. Nobody was going to. What he had was the shipping labels on the cold boxes staged in the loading corridor, and the whiteboards the technicians never erased, and the packing slips clipped to crates waiting for a courier at 4 in the morning when there was no one in the building but him. He read them the way another man might read a newspaper somebody left behind. A kilogram of fresh leaf yielded a few dozen milligrams of the protein they were after. And on one of those slips there was a figure. The first time he assumed he had misread the unit. He set the mop against the wall and checked it twice. That was the beginning of it. But it was not the thing that mattered most, and he came to understand the difference over those 2 years. The expensive part was not the plant. Anybody could grow the plant. The expensive part was the process, the batch record, the chain of custody, the temperature log, the signature on the line at the bottom of the form. He learned that 4 hours of heat on a cut leaf could turn a whole shipment into waste. He learned that a lot could be perfect in every measurable way and still be destroyed because a page was missing. He did not have a biology degree. He had never taken a college course in his life. What he had was 2 years of seeing, from the outside of the glass, exactly what got a batch rejected and exactly what got it accepted, which turned out to be knowledge that not one person in his home county possessed. Home was 75 acres an hour northwest, in the red clay of the Piedmont, and the Carters had been on that ground for 3 generations. Eli's great-grandfather had put his name on the deed in 1919, at a time when very few black families in that part of the state were able to hold paper on anything. And the family had understood ever since that the paper mattered as much as the dirt. Walter Carter had farmed it his whole adult life on a small quota, and he had never tried to be bigger than he was. He knew which field turned first in April, and which one held wet after a storm, and where the frost settled before it settled anywhere else. and he knew it in a way he never once explained out loud. Then the quota was gone. The thing that had been the foundation under his operation, the thing that had value the way a piece of equipment has value, simply stopped existing. And what was left was 75 acres and no way to sell what came off them. He leased the ground to a large contractor who ran corn and soybeans back to back, and the contractor took what contractors take. Eli saw the results every morning, coming in from the shift with the sun behind him. The clay had gone hard and bare between the rows. There was a plow pan under it that a shovel skidded off of. On the west slope, the water had opened gullies that got a little longer every year, and every March, after the first hard rain, a red stain ran out of the field into the roadside ditch and down toward the culvert under the county road. That was the part he could never get used to. It looked exactly like what it was. The land bleeding out onto the road. He knew what he was looking at, more or less. He did not know what to do about it. And that was the shape of him at 19, and it would have been obvious to anybody who thought about it for a minute. He could tell you why a shipment of leaf protein got rejected 200 miles from his own kitchen, and he had never in his life brought a single acre of anything to harvest. He had handed leaf. He had hung a barn. He had set stakes and pulled suckers and driven a tractor across a field somebody else was managing. That was the extent of it. And nobody in Caswell County was going to call him a farmer. Walter Carter died in February in the house he had lived in for most of 50 years. It rained for 10 days after. The ground turned to standing water and the burial had to wait, and Eli spent that stretch driving back and forth to the funeral home in a truck with a heater that only worked on the highest setting, wearing a suit that had been his grandfather's and fit him almost. The will was short, and it was clear. A lawyer over in Yanceyville had drawn it up 9 years earlier and updated it twice, and it left the 75 acres, the house, the old curing barn, and everything in both of them to his grandson, named in full, with no room anywhere for interpretation. Walter had been particular about that in a way that made no sense to Eli at the time. There had been a cookout years back when Eli was around 15, and the old man had cornered him by the tailgate and said, apropos of nothing anybody else at that cookout was discussing, that the fastest way to lose a place was to die without saying who it belonged to. Eli had nodded and gone back to his plate. He understood it now. He had grown up hearing the stories without hearing them. Families where the ground got left to be sorted out later, split among cousins nobody could locate, and then sold out from under every one of them by a court because no two heirs could agree on a fence line. Walter had read that formula somewhere in his life and had stopped it with one piece of paper. The lease ended with him. The contractor came in and took the last of what was standing and pulled the equipment off in March, and for the first time in 6 years, the Carter place stood empty. And Eli could see all of it at once. It was worse than he had understood. From the county road, the fields had only looked tired. Standing on them, he found gullies on the west slope deep enough to swallow his boot to the shin, and a crust on the flat ground cracked into a pattern like a map of somewhere, and a plow pan a foot down that turned the shovel sideways. He walked the whole west line one afternoon in a wind coming off nothing, and by the time he got back to the truck, he was not thinking about the acreage as land. He was thinking about it as something that was leaving. 3 weeks after the funeral, the county sent a letter. It was not a threat. It was an assessment, printed on both sides, listing the parcel and the improvements and the amount due in November, and it did not care at all who had died or when. Eli read it at the kitchen table with his coat still on. The number was not enormous. It was simply larger than what a person makes cleaning floors on the night shift, once you had also paid for insurance and power and a truck that was going to need a transmission before Christmas. And he had somewhere to be. That was what made it hard to sit still. Since the previous fall, he had been holding a seat in a 2-year laboratory technician program at a community college in Durham. There was a scholarship attached to it, and a hiring pipeline on the other end that was as close to a sure thing as anything gets. He had earned it himself, in the odd hours filling out the application at that same kitchen table with the shift still on his clothes, while cleaning floors for the exact industry he had just applied to enter. He had a letter with a start date in August and a phone number for a man named Ray Whitfield, who had told him, in the tone of somebody who had said it to a great many 19-year-olds, not to lose the letter. That was supposed to be the whole shape of the year. Walter would get better or he wouldn't. The lease would run. And in August, Eli would drive to Durham with a duffel bag and start being something. Instead, he was standing in a kitchen in the last week of March, holding a tax assessment for 75 acres that were coming apart, and the letter from Whitfield's program was lying on the other end of the table where he had left it in October, and he stood there long enough to notice something he wished he hadn't. The two pieces of paper were about the same size. He went out that evening and walked down to where the west slope broke and stood there until the light went. Nothing about the place looked dangerous. It just looked like it was on its way out. And there was no version of the next 6 months in which both of those letters got to be true. Messages. The first offer came before the ground had even dried. Dale Brenner ran better than 4,000 acres north of the Carter place and had the kind of voice that made everything sound like it had already been settled. He did not come to the house. He caught Eli in the parking lot of the hardware store in town, shook his hand, said something decent about Walter, and then named a figure for the whole 75. House, barn, ground, all of it. It was low. Eli did not know much, but he knew what dirt went for in that county, and it was low by a third. Brenner did not pretend otherwise. The place was worn out, he said, and everybody knew it. And at Eli's age, a man ought to be glad somebody was willing to take a problem off his hands. Ed Fowler came by a few days later with a gentler version of the same idea. Keep the house in the yard, sell the back acreage, save yourself 10 years of grief. When Eli didn't answer, Fowler reached for the sentence people in that county seemed to keep in a drawer for occasions like this one. You've got feeling for this place, son. Feeling doesn't pay property taxes. Eli's mother was not sentimental about it either. Denise Carter had spent 2 years driving out on her days off to check on Walter, and she had watched the place wear him down from the inside while it wore down from the outside. And she was tired in a way her son could hear over the phone. She wanted him in Durham. She said so plainly once, and then never brought it up again, which was worse than if she had brought it up every week. That ground took everything your grandfather had, she told him. Don't stand there and let it take you too. The third road closed on its own. Commercial tobacco meant a contract with a buyer, a curing setup, and working capital, which meant borrowing. Eli sat across a desk from a loan officer in Yanceyville who was polite for 11 minutes and then explained, without ever once using the words, that a young man with no operating history does not get that number. So he sold what was no longer going to be used. The curing barn's burners, the setter, both tractors, the stakes, the plastic, the tobacco trailers rusting behind the shed. He did it in one weekend to 3 different buyers, added the proceeds to the modest life insurance check that came through in April, and sat down and looked at the total. It was enough to do one thing well. It was nowhere near enough to do everything badly. He found the notebooks while he was looking for fence pliers. There were 11 of them, stacked in a wooden crate under the workbench. The cheap kind with cardboard covers, every one of them full of his grandfather's handwriting. At first he thought they were weather logs. They were more than that. Walter had written down which field came down with black shank and in what year, where the water went after a storm, which corner the frost took first, which one greened up last, which draw held wet into June. He had mapped that farm 1 page at a time across 30 years without ever once calling it a map. And in the back of every book, on a page ruled off by hand, there was a column of numbers with a date beside each one. It took Eli most of an hour to work out what he was reading. Topsoil, the same 4 places, once a year, every spring, a spade and a tape and a figure written down. The early books had 1 number. The middle books had a smaller one. The last book had a number less than half of where the column started, and underneath it, in handwriting gone shaky, 3 words. Still going down. Eli sat on the barn floor with the book open on his knee. His grandfather had known. For 30 years he had known in inches, and every spring he had measured it and written it down and put the book back in the crate and gone out to work anyway. He had not been ignoring it. He had been watching it happen and had been too tired or too alone to start the whole thing over, which meant nothing about that place was a mystery anymore. Walter had already done the hard part and left it in a crate under a workbench. Somebody just had to act on it. There was one more page. In the book from 1994, Walter had copied out a spray schedule he had inherited from his own father, an arsenic and lead compound, standard in its day, and written a single line beneath it. My father put this out 14 years. Nobody ever told him anything. Eli read it, understood that it was sad, and did not understand that it was anything else. He would understand that in September of the following year. He spent 6 weeks walking the property every morning with the last notebook in his jacket, checking his grandfather's pages against what was in front of him, and the pages held. The water went where Walter said it went. The shovel skidded where Walter had circled 9 years before. And in the second week of April, he called Ray Whitfield and told him he would not be coming in August. Whitfield asked if he was sure. Eli looked out the kitchen window at the worst ground in the county and said that he was. He said the rest of it out loud exactly once, to exactly one person, and the person was Whitfield, because there was nobody else who would have understood a word of it. He was going to plant tobacco, not the kind anyone in Caswell County grew, a near-nicotine-free variety used as a biological platform to produce pharmaceutical proteins. The short, thick-leaved plants that stood in trays under panel lights in Growth Chamber 3, behind glass he had never been allowed to walk through. He had mopped the corridor outside that chamber for 2 years. He knew who bought what came out of it, and he knew what they were paying. He did not break the ground open. That was the first thing people noticed, and it was the thing they could not get past. A young man taking over 75 worn-out acres was supposed to plow. Eli spent $60 on soil tests before he spent $1 on anything else, laid the results over his grandfather's pages, and divided the property on paper into zones, not by field lines, but by what the ground was actually doing in each place. He put lime and compost only where the numbers said it would earn back the cost, which turned out to be a fraction of what he had assumed. He seeded cover into the worst of the gullies and left last year's residue lying where the contractor's combine had dropped it, which offended people almost personally. He had already sold the barn's burners because this leaf did not cure. It went cold, and he intended to cut it green at a plant age no farmer in that county had ever harvested anything. From the county road, it looked like neglect with a plan behind it. Then a refrigerated truck came up the lane in May with the seedlings. There were thousands of them, and they were not impressive. Short, thick-leaved, a heavy dull green, standing in trays like something that had already been through a bad season. The driver had Eli sign for them, looked once at the west slope, and did not ask what they were for. Dewey Prather watched from the road for most of an hour before he came over. He ran a few hundred acres of tobacco 1.5 miles north, had known Walter Carter for 30-some years, had pulled the Carter truck out of the ditch more than once, and believed, not maliciously, just completely, that he understood that particular ground better than the young man now standing in the middle of it. "What kind of tobacco is that?" Dewey said. Eli kept setting plants. "Tobacco. I can see it's tobacco." "Then we're making progress." Dewey walked a little way down the row, looking at the squat things in their mulch, and asked who Eli was selling to. "Nobody yet. It's 3 years out." That was when he said the thing that stuck. "A tobacco nobody can smoke isn't a crop," he told him. "It's a weed with paperwork." And then, because he had earned the right to, and because he thought it might land, he added that Walter Carter had never in his life planted an acre of anything without knowing ahead of time who was buying it. Eli did not answer that. He would carry the sentence around for 2 years, taking it out and looking at it more often than he would have admitted to anyone. The county filled in the rest, At the feed store, a man said the Carter boy had put in tobacco with no nicotine in it, and somebody asked what that made it. And somebody else said grass. Ed Fowler's opinion, delivered second-hand, was that the boy had found something on the internet, invented by people who had never once broken their back under a Piedmont July and never would. And underneath all of it ran a different sentence, one Eli heard often enough that he eventually stopped reacting to it. Give it a few years, people said. That ground'll change hands. They didn't say it as a wish or an insult. They said it the way they said it was going to be a dry July. He rarely argued, partly because arguing with a feed store is a losing proposition, and partly because he knew perfectly well the plants were not magic. They would need water while they established. Some would die. Some would come up crooked, and the whole thing rested on a harvest window he had read about for 2 years and had never once stood inside of. The first crop came up better than it had any right to. He cut it in September, chilled it in a small insulated room he had built himself in a corner of the barn out of foam board and a window unit, and sent samples off for testing. Not because anyone asked him to, but because he knew exactly what they were going to measure. He had carried rejected batch records out of a corridor with his own 2 hands. The leaf passed on protein. The leaf failed on heavy metals. Cadmium and arsenic over the pharmaceutical threshold. Not by a little, by multiples. 14 years of an arsenic and lead compound put out by a man who was never told anything, on top of 100 years of the same crop on the same acid clay. And it was worse than worthless. It was regulated waste. He could not sell it. He could not give it away. He had to destroy it. Eli sat at the kitchen table that evening with the lab report and the 1994 notebook open beside each other for a long time. The page that had saved him in April was the page that had just ruined him. Then he did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic turned around on him. The cadmium number in the leaf was high because the plant had pulled it out of the ground. That was what this crop did. Tobacco was an accumulator. It was the reason it had always been the worst thing in the world to smoke, and it was the reason it might be the best thing in the world to plant on dirt like his. Every crop he burned was a quantity of metal permanently off his farm. He worked it out on the back of an invoice. 3 more crops, maybe 4. 3 plantings, 3 cuttings, 3 fires. His grandfather had never put in an acre without knowing who was buying it. Eli had just figured out that he was going to grow 300-acre crops for nobody at all. He burned the first one on an afternoon in the last week of September. The whole county saw the smoke. Dewey Prather stood out on the road and watched it go up and did not come in. That summer had cost him in other ways, too. Disease took a share. An irrigation line cracked underground in a stretch he'd assumed was fine and ran dry for 11 days before he found it. Deer got into a row and worked it end to end with a thoroughness that felt like commentary. He replanted. There was nothing else to do with the information. And in April, he took his grandfather's spade and his grandfather's tape out to the same 4 places, measured, and wrote the figure in the back of the last book, underneath the shaky handwriting. It was smaller than Walter's last one. He had expected that, and it landed anyway. By then, he was driving again. Curtis Pryor, who managed the building down at the research park, had never entirely understood why Eli left, and was glad enough to have somebody willing to take nights. So, the shape of that year was 2 hours in the truck each evening, a shift with a scrubber and a bin cart, 2 hours back with the sun coming up, and then however much daylight he could stay awake for. He rented equipment instead of buying it, and returned it clean and on time, because a kid with no credit who returns things clean gets to rent them again. His mother stopped talking about selling. She also stopped asking about the tobacco, and Eli understood exactly what that meant, and neither of them said so. Dewey drove past one afternoon that spring and found him setting replacements into the gaps. He pulled over and got out, but didn't come far. Still the plan? Eli looked down the row at the empty spaces, which were the only thing about that field a man could see from where Dewey was standing. Still the plan. The ground answered before the market did, and it answered in a way nobody could have photographed. A storm came through in the middle of May of the second year, the kind that had opened the west slope the spring before. Eli had walked that slope after every rain since the funeral, and knew its channels the way a person knows a scar. He went out when it cleared, expecting to find them deeper. The water had gone down. It had not run. Behind the cover, where the residue and the seeded grasses had knit into something continuous, the soil had simply stayed where it was. He crouched and put his hand flat on it and felt nothing give. Then he walked out to the roadside ditch, because that was where he had gone every march of his life without ever meaning to, and stood there a while. The water in it was clear. 2 miles up, at the culvert below Dale Brenner's place, the ditch was running the color of a wound. Under the residue, when he dug, there was a dark, crumbling layer about the thickness of a fingernail that had not been there when he started. Worms in it. Beetles. Birds working the field edge in the evening and then staying. And the number that mattered most came back in the fall. The second-year leaf test showed cadmium still over the pharmaceutical threshold, but lower than the year before. Not by much, but in the right direction, and by roughly the magnitude he had scratched onto the back of an invoice 14 months earlier. The machine was running. None of it produced a check. He burned the second crop in September the same as the first, and stood out there in the heat with the ashes and the smell, and nobody to tell. Then, in August of that second year, a full year before there would be anything to sell, the phone rang in the kitchen. The man introduced himself as Marcus Dowd, and said he handled raw material sourcing for a contract manufacturing outfit in Maryland. He had heard from a seedling supplier that somebody out in the Piedmont had put in a serious block of that particular line. Eli had not told many people the name of what he was growing. He had not hidden it exactly. He had just answered tobacco so many times that the answer had become a habit. And it had never once occurred to him that his own seedling invoice was a public document in a very small industry. Dowd wanted numbers, acres, spacing, expression levels, and whether Eli had heavy metals data yet. Eli gave careful answers and committed to no volume at all because he had exactly 0 commercial deliveries behind him and knew that the fastest way to be finished in a specialty market is to promise a quantity and then not have it. Then he told him the cadmium figure straight out. There was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough to mean something, and then Dowd said that in that case, Eli didn't have anything to sell. "I will," Eli said. "Year 4, and I'll have 3 years of data showing which way it's moving and how fast." That was the sentence that made Dowd call back in the spring. He did call back, which was more than Eli had let himself expect. But before he hung up that August, Dowd asked one more thing, easily, almost as an afterthought. "Who do you work for out there?" Eli looked out the kitchen window at the block for a moment before he said it. "It's my place." There was a small adjustment on the other end of the line. Not hostility, nothing you could have written down. Just a man reordering something in his head. Dowd said that was great, said he'd follow up in the spring, and did. 3 weeks later, an email came in from a biopharmaceutical company in New Jersey asking whether he'd consider contracting acreage, and mentioning, in a paragraph that read like it had been through a lawyer, that their current supply came from overseas and they were not comfortable with it. Supply chain, auditability, geopolitical exposure. From the county road, the field was still a block of dull green belonging to a fool who set fire to his own harvest. Nobody at the diner in town revised anything, but the market had found him a year before the crop did. He started keeping the names on the page opposite the column in his grandfather's last notebook, because it was the closest thing he had to evidence. And something turned over in him that fall, and he could feel it even though he could not have said what it was. For 2 years, the only question anybody had asked about him was whether he had lost his mind. That question was finished. Nobody was ever going to answer it out loud, and it didn't matter, because the new question was harder, and it belonged entirely to him. Not whether he could grow it. He could grow it. whether he could get it clean. He did the third planting in the spring with a different quality of attention. He tightened the irrigation. He kept a soil log for every zone. He drove down to the research park at night and mopped the corridor outside Growth Chamber 3 and read the whiteboards the way a man reads a scouting report. And once, in the loading corridor at 4 in the morning, a courier ran late, and Eli stood beside a staged cold box for 6 or 7 minutes with the manifest right there under the plastic sleeve at eye level, and read every line of it. Threshold, method, specification, signature block. He had been reading those forms for 3 years. He had never once been the person whose name went on the bottom. Dewey drove past in June and did not stop. Ed Fowler's assessment made it back to him by way of the feed store, unchanged. Denise called on Sundays and asked about the truck and the weather and never about the crop. And out on the west slope, in ground that had been coming apart the first time he stood on it, the gullies had healed over and gone soft-edged, and the soil under the cover held moisture into the first week of July. Nobody could see that from the road either. By the beginning of the third summer, everything about that farm was visibly working, and the bank account behaved as though none of it existed. That was the stretch nobody had warned him about. Not the year he lost a share of the crop to disease and a cracked line and a row of deer. This. The gullies were gone. The ground behind the cover held water into July when nothing else in the county did. The plants stood better than anything that had come off that place in his lifetime. And there was still nothing to sell. The field looked like an accomplishment. It was not an accomplishment. It was a bet that had not been called yet. He had taken the April topsoil measurement out of stubbornness more than hope, and that number had gone down for the 3rd year running. By less than before, by little enough that it could have been a signal or could have been a rounding error, and he had no way on earth to tell which. The broker came up the lane in the 2nd week of June. He was courteous and professional, and he had a sample contract in a folder on the seat beside him and a rental sticker in the back window. His client was a nicotine pouch company that needed cheap leaf biomass for extraction. They did not test for cadmium. Nobody made them. The finished product went to export markets where residue thresholds were a theoretical question. "There's nothing illegal about any of it," the man said. And that was the worst part, because he was right. Everybody sells where they can sell. Then he said the number out loud. Both of Eli's burned crops, plus the one standing in the field, paid on delivery. Enough for the taxes and the transmission, and a curing setup and one clear breath after 3 years of holding one. It was good enough that Eli felt it in his stomach. And when Eli didn't answer right away, the man offered him the other version, in the same reasonable voice. If the pouch business didn't appeal, there was a cleaner route. Blend the hot leaf with somebody else's clean leaf and bring the average down under the threshold. Nobody would ever separate it out again. "Everybody averages," he said. "That's how the industry works." That one went straight into pharmaceutical supply, and both of them knew it. What Eli thought about was a trash bag. There had been a night on the 3rd shift, a year and a half earlier, when he emptied the bins in the corridor outside the clean rooms, and one of them held a destroyed batch record. Hundreds of pages. Months of work by people whose names were on every sheet, thrown out over a single deviation. He had stood there in a corridor at 2 in the morning with the bag in his hand, and had a thought he was not able to put down afterward. Somebody, somewhere, was not going to get that. That was what he had learned mopping a floor, which nobody taught him and nobody would have thought to. A residue threshold is not paperwork. It is a person with a line in their arm. There was another thing in the room, too, and he did not say it, and it did not need saying. His grandmother had died of lung cancer when Eli was small. Walter had grown the thing that killed his wife for 30 years because it was the only thing that ground was permitted to grow. "I know what's in my leaf," Eli said. "If I sell it to you, I still know." The broker was not offended in the slightest. He asked what Eli planned to do with it instead. "Burn it, same as the last 2. The man said he'd think about it, left a card on the kitchen table, and did not call again that summer. The card stayed on the table. Eli did not throw it away. Dewey Prather made his last run at him in the middle of July, on an evening when Eli was walking an irrigation line with a wrench, hunting a leak he could hear and could not find. 3 years, Dewey said. You've spent 3 years growing something you have to set on fire. Eli found the fitting and knelt on it. It's a useful fire. Useful doesn't mean profitable, Dewey told him, and it was not cruelty. It was almost the opposite. He was a man watching somebody he had known since childhood do a thing he was certain would end badly, and he had run out of ways to say it. No, Eli said, but profitable doesn't have to mean destructive. Dewey crossed his arms and looked down the row at the block going on toward the property line, and then he asked the question that had been the actual bottom of everything he'd been saying for 3 years. Did Eli honestly believe there was a company anywhere that was going to pay real money for a tobacco nobody could smoke? Eli tightened the connection, felt the line firm up under his hand, and stood. I think the right buyers already have, he said. They're just paying somebody else. Dewey left unconvinced. He would have said, if anybody had asked him at the feed store that week, that Walter Carter's grandson was about to learn something expensive, and he would not have been entirely wrong, which was the part Eli could not have known yet. For all the names on the page opposite the column, for all the emails and the careful answers and the 3 years of soil logs, everything he had built now depended on one thing he had never done. He had grown the leaf 3 times. He had never once gotten a lot of anything to the door of the place that would receive it. He burned the 3rd crop in September, the same as the 2 before it, and went back to nights. Then the test came back in the 1st week of July in the 4th summer. Cadmium under threshold. For the first time. Target protein expression inside the acceptable band. It was the brightest moment of Elijah Carter's life. And it was a number on a sheet of paper on a kitchen table at 6 o'clock in the evening, and there was not a single person on earth who could see it from the county road. He carried the page out to the porch and stood there holding it, and there was nobody to tell. He called Marcus Dowd. Dowd called back inside of 40 minutes, and the bad news arrived in the same conversation as the good. New Jersey had walked away from the table, not because of the leaf, because of him. A single grower, 22 years old, no delivery history, no certifications, nobody standing behind him. 3 months of correspondence, and the internal conclusion had come down to one line. Supplier risk too high. Clean was not enough. He had to prove he could deliver. But Dowd had one thing left. There was a processing slot at the extraction facility, booked back in March by a supplier who had just canceled. If Eli had spec-grade biomass at that door inside the window, they would run it. And a lot that had actually run was the only object in the world that could reopen the door in New Jersey. If he missed it, the next slot was next year, and he did not have a next year. Everything after that was a clock. The window was 5 days. The target protein peaked and then fell off. Cut early and there wasn't enough of it. Cut late, and it had already begun to come apart. The leaf had to be at temperature within hours of cutting, because the enzymes in the tissue started breaking down the protein the moment the plant was severed. And it was July in the Piedmont, and the afternoons were running 95. Nothing could be bruised. Bruised leaf was ruptured cells. No stacking. No sitting in the sun, not for 5 minutes. And the thing that could kill all of it was the paper. Every container tagged. Cut time, block, cutter, temperature. One deviation anywhere in the chain of custody and the entire lot was rejected. Not that container, the lot. Eli knew that with a precision nobody else in Caswell County could have matched, because he had carried a destroyed batch record out of a corridor with his own 2 hands. He had read every procedure for 3 years and had never executed one at scale because there had never been a scale to execute. He needed hands, and he needed cold, and he needed both of them inside 5 days, and he had neither. He started calling. Both custom crews within reach were booked into September, and one of the schedulers told him kindly that he should have booked in March. A refrigerated hauler out of Greensboro had trucks and a calendar and no room in it. A cold storage outfit quoted him a seasonal number that was more than the lot was worth, and he did the arithmetic on the back of an invoice and thanked the man. A vegetable packer's hydro cooler was full of melons. He called Dale Brenner, whose cold storage was sitting empty until his own crop came in, and Brenner was perfectly polite for 4 minutes and then explained that he was going to need it. He left a message for Curtis Pryor down at the research park that he was half ashamed to leave. And on the second day, out of something he would not have called hope, he called Dewey Prather. It rang until it stopped. Nobody picked up. Eli sat with the phone in his hand for a while afterward. So he went out and did it himself. He worked the first night by headlamp with shears and a stack of totes, cutting and hauling, moving leaf into the little insulated room he had built out of foam board and a window unit. It filled in 90 minutes. After that, there was nowhere to put anything. He kept cutting anyway because stopping felt worse. The tar came through his gloves and up the inside of his forearms, black and impossible to wash off, and dried into a shell. The headlamp made a circle about 4 feet across. Outside it, in the dark, the rows ran on for a quarter mile. At 2 in the morning, he stopped and looked at what he had done, and it was not 1 full block. 3 years. 3 crops burned in that same field where he was standing. A seat in Durham he had turned down over a phone line. 2 years of night shifts on top of it. A column of figures in a dead man's notebook that had gone down 3 more times since he took it over. A company that had already walked. A processing slot with an expiration date on it. And a cadmium number that had finally, after 3 years, come in right. Exactly once, for a crop he could not get cold. He came in at 2:30 and stood in the kitchen with the light off, and the broker's card was still lying on the table where it had been since June. He looked at it for a long moment. The county had been right all along, he thought. This ground was going to change hands, just not for any reason a single one of them had guessed. He was in the yard at 4:40 the next morning, moving totes into space that did not exist, when he heard a truck downshift out on the county road and slow for his lane. It was Dewey Prather, backing a refrigerated trailer up past the barn with one arm over the seat and his eyes on the mirror, setting it square in the middle of the yard like he had measured the spot years ago. He got out, walked around the back, and through the doors. Eli knew that trailer. Dewey rented it every July from the same outfit in Danville for the week he moved his own leaf. That week started Monday. There was no speech. Eli would think about that afterward. That after 3 years of being called a fool, the end of it arrived without a single word of apology. "Your granddad loaned me equipment for 20 years, Dewey said. "Show me where to cut." He never said whether he had seen the missed call. Eli never asked. Eli stood there with a tote in his arms and his forearms in the condition they were in, and what he wanted to say was several things at once. So he said none of them and pointed at the second block in from the west line. By 7, there were 4 more vehicles. Curtis Pryor had driven up from the research park on his day off with 2 of the night crew because of a message Eli had left on Tuesday and never expected anything to come of. A teacher from the school in town who had called back in June about bringing a group out to look at the field came instead with a van load of older students and a case of water and stayed until dark. Ed Fowler, the man who had told him that Feeling doesn't pay property taxes, showed up in a clean shirt without explaining himself, and by noon the shirt was finished. The man who managed the feed store, the one who 3 years earlier had wanted to know what kind of grass Eli was putting in, came with his own shears and did not bring it up. Not all of them came out of kindness. A few came because the county paper had run a photograph. A few came because Dewey Prather had spent the previous evening on the phone, and Dewey Prather was a man whose calls got answered. 1 or 2 came to watch it fail from close range. It did not matter. They came. And here was the part nobody in that yard had expected, least of all Dewey. Eli ran it. He could not stand back and let them work. A bruised leaf did not cost that leaf. A mislabeled container did not cost that container. Either one could take the whole lot, and 4 years were sitting in the hands of 40 people, not one of whom had ever done this before. So he stopped everything for the first 30 minutes and taught them. He walked the row with a plant in his hand and showed them where the cut went and at what leaf age and why. Don't grip the leaf face. Don't stack more than 3 deep. Don't leave a tote in the sun. Not for 5 minutes, not for one. He put people in pairs, one cutting and one running totes, and he moved down the line all morning correcting hands. And he set up the table, a folding table at the head of the block with a stack of forms on it, and he gave 2 of the students exactly one job. Every container, one line. Time, block, cutter, temperature. He told them in front of everybody that the table mattered more than the shears did. When Ed Fowler stacked a tote too deep, Eli said so, plainly, right there in front of all of them. Fowler said he understood and did it right from then on. Nobody argued with him. That was the strange thing. Somewhere between the first tote and the 3rd hour, that yard quietly agreed on something the diner in town had refused to agree on for 3 years, which was that there was exactly one person on that property who knew what he was doing, and he was 22, and he was the one giving directions. The system found its rhythm. Cut leaf went into the trailer within minutes. Temperature logged every hour on the hour. A load ran for Maryland at midnight, and another trailer came back to take its place. And the moment the whole line stopped to watch was not a beautiful one. It was a hand probe pushed down into the middle of a freshly closed tote, and the number on the readout sitting inside the band. Eli read it out loud. Somebody clapped. Then the whole yard clapped, for a figure that 3 years earlier not one of them could have told you the meaning of. Dewey moved his own leaf that Monday out of a neighbor's barn, on somebody else's schedule, from somebody else's cooler, and never mentioned it. The tar got into everybody's hands so deep it stopped washing off, and by the 3rd day it was no longer a stain, but a condition of employment. Dewey, who had spent 30 years in that crop and thought he was past being surprised by it, looked at his own hands on the 3rd evening and said something about the plant that Eli decided not to repeat. Denise Carter came out on her day off and worked the table, and asked her son for the first time in 3 years what the numbers on the forms actually meant. He told her. She wrote them down for 9 hours and did not mention Durham once. There were folding tables in the yard with food on them that Eli had not organized and never learned who had. At night, after the last of them left, he walked the block with a flashlight checking what the morning held, and the trailer hummed behind him in the dark, and the sound of it was the best sound he had ever heard. The last load pulled out of the yard on the night of the 5th day, inside the window, into the slot, and every plant on that farm was still standing. The lot ran. 3 weeks later, the results came back from the extraction facility. The biomass met specification, and the chain of custody documentation came through with not one deviation in it. And that was the line that made the phone ring. Not the expression level, the paperwork. The buyers came while Eli was still washing totes in the yard. There were 3 vehicles in front of the barn before 8 o'clock one morning in the last week of August. Marcus Dowd's man, a representative from New Jersey back again, and a woman named Karen Voss, who ran supply chain for one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country and had driven half the night with a laptop, a notebook, and enough questions to stay the whole day. She got out and took in the yard, the trailer, the folding table, the stack of forms weighted down with a wrench, the field behind all of it, and looked for whoever was in charge. What she found was a young black man scrubbing a plastic tote with a brush. She asked where she could find the owner. He wiped his hands on his jeans. "You're looking at him." What kept her there was not the field, it was the folding table. She picked up the stack of forms and read through it, and understood that a 22-year-old in Caswell County had just run a cleaner chain of custody than 2 suppliers her company had terminated that year. And she was direct about why she had come, which was the thing that made the offer believable. "I'm not here for your story, Mr. Carter," she said. "I'm here for your records. Domestic supply. Auditable. No geopolitical exposure." She needed him for reasons entirely her own, and both of them knew it, and Eli found that he preferred it that way. What he was offered was not a check. It was a multi-year supply and development agreement, spec-grade biomass, priced by the kilogram of target protein, with volumes stepping up over the term, an advance against cold infrastructure, and a regional exclusivity clause. Totaled across 5 years, the figure at the bottom of the page had 7 digits in it. He read it at the kitchen table with his coat still on. The same table, the same posture, the same light coming in the window as the morning 3 years earlier when he had opened an assessment from the county and understood that 2 pieces of paper were the same size. The letter from Durham had gone into the crate under the workbench a long time before, filed in with his grandfather's notebooks, which was where it belonged. He held 3 things in the negotiation, and all 3 of them came out of a corridor floor. The land stayed his. He was a supplier, not a tenant on his own deed. He kept rights to the adapted line and to 4 years of soil data and did not sell an exclusive on either one in perpetuity. And primary processing stayed in the region. None of which made him rich, and that was never the honest version of it. He still had debt. The transmission the truck had needed since the funeral finally went in and took most of the advance with it. The agreement was contingent on him hitting specification again every year for 5 years, and the cadmium had only just come in under threshold, with no margin under it at all. 1 bad summer, 1 deviation, and the termination clause was on page 4. Some buyers wanted volumes he could not come close to and lost interest when he told them so. Others quoted prices that would have been reasonable if you assumed nobody's hands had gone black for 5 days. And the harvest would have buried him on labor. The only reason it hadn't was that half the county had worked it for nothing. But the farm had crossed a line, and Eli could see exactly where it was. The field was not an experiment anymore, it was revenue, and it was producing revenue while still doing the job he had planted it to do in the first place, which had never stopped for a single day in 3 years. He was not standing on one leg either. That had been the design before a single plant went in the ground, because he had stood outside a clean room and seen what one customer's mood does to a supplier nobody has ever heard of. Spec-grade biomass carried the main agreement. Food-grade plant protein came out of what was left after extraction, the fraction that on most operations goes into a pile behind the building. Seed pressed for oil, a thing the Carters had thrown away for 3 generations. Certified clean seedling stock, sold to growers in the region. And the one nobody could have guessed. He had 4 years of documented data on drawing heavy metals down out of Piedmont clay, and the county was full of Piedmont clay. People began paying him to do the exact work they had laughed at. Dewey Prather came down the lane alone in October and parked by the barn. Eli was washing harvest equipment. Neither of them said anything about the agreement or the buyers or the month the whole county had spent talking about the Carter place. Dewey looked west at the block. "How much you figure those things pulled out of that dirt?" "More than they did the first year." Then he wanted to know about the winters and the disease pressure and the water. "More while they're young," Eli told him. "Less once they're established. But not none." Dewey nodded slowly at that, the way a man nods when the answer proves you've been paying attention. And then he asked the question Eli had been waiting 3 years to hear. "Where'd you buy your seed?" Eli did not gloat. He had thought once or twice during the second winter about what he would say if this ever happened, and now that it had, he found he did not want any of it. He walked him through it instead. Spacing, leaf age, the cutting window, the first crop he had to burn, and the line that cracked where he couldn't see it, and the deer. And what 5 days of that tar does to a man's hands. Then he told him not to do it. "Not because it looks like money," Eli said. "Have a buyer before you have a plant. Test your ground first. Test it. Don't guess. Because you don't know what your father put out there. And understand the paperwork, all of it. before you put in 10 acres of anything. Dewey looked at him for a moment. You talking me out of it? No, Eli said. I'm talking you into doing it right. The following spring, he opened one more block. Not the farm. A block, laid along the shoulder of the high ground where his grandfather's pages and his own soil numbers agreed that the dirt was still leaving. He had learned enough by then to be afraid of his own good year. A man who has just come through a July like that one is the most dangerous thing on his own property. And Eli had a notebook full of reasons to move slower than his confidence wanted to. He signed with an extraction facility 40 minutes away instead of shipping raw biomass out of the region. It cost him a little on paper. It meant the value of what grew on the Carter place stopped at a building where people he knew went to work. He hired 2 of that spring's graduates for the season, the same 2 who had kept the folding table through those 5 days, and paid them what the work was actually worth, which was more than he had ever been paid to clean a laboratory floor before daylight. He taught them where the cut went, and he taught them the table before he let either of them touch a mature plant. He started working with a university in the region, not for the notice, but because 4 years of soil data was a thing they did not have, and a laboratory was a thing he did not have. He opened the data to other young growers, free, on one condition. They had to test their ground first. The long-term plan had never been to bury 75 acres in pharmaceutical tobacco. It was to build a diversified farm around the conditions those 4 years had created. Some of it would go back into forage. Some would carry annual crops on the ground that had come clean. Some would go into perennials once he could afford to wait on them. And the tobacco would go on doing 4 things at once: pulling metal, holding soil, generating data, and generating income. And there is one more thing worth saying before the lights go down on it, which is that on that farm, nothing was easy to see. There was no color. Nobody slowed down. From the county road, it was a tobacco field, and a tobacco field in Caswell County is the most ordinary thing in the world. The change was where nobody looked. Water going down instead of sideways. A dark, crumbling layer under the residue that had not existed the first time he put a shovel in. The roadside ditch running clear after a hard March rain, while 2 miles up, below Dale Brenner's place, the culvert still ran the color of a wound. And places on that farm where a person could now put in something for other people to eat, which had not been true of a single acre when Eli inherited it. In April, he took the measurement. The same 4 places, the same spade, the same tape, the way his grandfather had done it for 30 years before him. Year 1, it had gone down. Year 2, it had gone down. Year 3, it had gone down by an amount so small he wrote it twice to be sure. He carried the last book out to the west line, set it on the tailgate, and wrote the 4th figure under the 3 he had added, and under the shaky handwriting above all of them that said, "Still going down." It was bigger than the one above it. Not by much. By an amount you would have to know the column to notice. For the first time in 34 years, it had gone up. And on the facing page was the other column, cadmium, 4 years of it, milligrams per kilogram, running the other direction the entire way. His grandfather had kept 30 years of a number he could not make rise. Eli had kept 4 years of 2 numbers, and both of them were finally moving the way they were supposed to, and both of them were in the same cardboard notebook. People told the story afterward as a young man getting lucky because a drug company happened to need tobacco leaf, and that was the smallest part of it. The real decision had never been which crop to plant. It was that he refused to separate the health of the product from the health of the place that made it. He had stood outside a clean room and understood that at the far end of every one of those lots was a person with a line in their arm, and he could not make the arithmetic work in his head. How a thing meant to heal one person could be grown by poisoning the ground and everybody downstream of it. And there is a formula by which land belonging to families like his has disappeared in this country, and every family it happened to could recite it. The ground gets used until it can't feed anybody. Then it gets sold cheap to the man across the fence. And everyone agrees afterward that it was simply what the market wanted. Eli did not beat that formula by holding on hard. He beat it by making the land worth holding. So the most valuable thing those 4 years ever produced was not a 7-figure agreement. It was proof that the same plant which had emptied that ground for 100 years could be used to give it back. That farmland does not have to be exhausted before it turns a profit. And that sometimes the best crop is not the one that takes the most out of the dirt. It's the one that takes out exactly what needed to go. There's something in this worth carrying out of it, and it isn't about tobacco. Elijah Carter did not win because he believed in himself harder than his neighbors believed in him. He won because he had spent 2 years looking at something everybody else walked past. He mopped a corridor. He read the packing slips nobody thought to hide. And when he came home, the thing he actually owned was not 75 acres of bad clay. It was a piece of knowledge that had no value in the building where he learned it, and enormous value on the ground where he took it. Most of us are already standing somewhere like that corridor. There is a thing you understand from where you sit that the people upstream of you take for granted, and you may have decided it doesn't count because nobody handed you a certificate for it. It counts. It is often the only real advantage a person gets. The other half of it is harder, and it's the part that would have been easy to write differently. There was an evening in June when a man in a rental car offered him 3 crops worth of money for leaf he knew was contaminated, and everything about that offer was legal, and nobody would ever have found out. He said no while he was broke, not after. That refusal is the reason a woman drove half the night 18 months later and told him she'd come for his records, because the only thing he'd been building the whole time was the right to be believed. And you cannot buy that in a hurry. You build it in the years when nobody is watching, and there is nothing on the other end of it yet. So here's what I'd genuinely like to know, and I hope you'll tell me. What's the thing you understand from where you're standing that the people around you don't see yet? I read the replies. Say it out loud down there. Somebody else needs to hear that they aren't the only one holding something that hasn't paid yet.